Welcome to Leadership Lessons from the Fastlane, brought to you by the Washington Speakers Bureau. In this space, we will explore some of the most pressing challenges that leaders face today with the world's most respected, innovative, curious, and accomplished thought leaders. We'd like to welcome our host, best-selling author and co-author of the recently published book, Choose Love, Not Fear, a WSB exclusive speaker for almost 30 years, Gary Heil.
This is Leadership Lessons from the Fastlane. I'm Gary Heil. Today's guest is General Joseph Dunford. General Dunford is the 19th Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the 36th Commandant of the United States Marine Corps. When he retired in 2019, he was not only the highest-ranking military officer in the United States, he had spent more than 40 years on active duty serving our country in theaters around the world. He presently serves as a member of the board of directors of Lockheed Martin Corporation. He's a graduate of St. Michael's College and holds graduate degrees from Georgetown University and the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Welcome, General. Thanks for spending some time with us this morning.
Hey, thanks, Gary. Good to see you.
And thank you for the many years of service you provided to our country. I don't think I could say enough about that. So I thank you before we get started, and I'm sure I'll be thanking you again. 40 years is a long time, and where you've served has really protected our country. Thank you.
No, thanks, Gary. Thanks.
I've noticed, Joe, that when you've talked about leadership, you've picked the words positive persuasion. Every time you do, I find myself cheering and saying, I get that. But I'm not sure that we understand totally what that means to you. Can you give us an idea of why you picked the words positive persuasion?
Sure, I can, Gary. First of all, I've been privileged to spend my life around people that are largely self-motivated. They're committed to a mission. And frankly, what I think the leader has to do is inspire them to do it and just give them the broad guidance on what to do and unleash them to go do it. And so from a positive perspective, what I mean by that is creating a climate where there's a degree of energy getting after a common vision, right? So the team is ready to do it, and they all want to do it. And so you're convincing them, you're selling them on a vision. And then with regard to persuasion, what I mean by that is, again, giving them what is it you want to do and guiding them towards that mission, as opposed to, I guess the opposite would be an authoritative style where you're actually given a prescriptive solution to a problem and you're overseeing and trying to control somebody in the execution of a task. When I talk about persuasion, it's the act of guiding them so they actually can unleash their initiative and allow them to figure out the best way to solve the problem. And I think that's particularly relevant the more senior you become.
Yeah, I had a mentor once that told me that the first decision that any leader makes is to choose love or to choose fear. To choose positive emotion is what he meant, or to choose to lead from fear. So you wouldn't have disagreed with him that that's probably primary to how you see yourself as a leader.
Gary, you talk about fear as one of the options, and I don't think there's really a choice to be made between the two. I think leading by fear is going to create a degree of brittleness inside of an organization. You're going to have people that are afraid to make a mistake as opposed to being anxious to seize opportunities and improve the organization. So, I do think that those are probably two alternatives, but one of them is unlikely to be effective. Certainly, in my experience, I've not seen any environment within which fear can be used as a successful leadership tool. In the near term, it can be used. And at a low tactical level, if you will, it might be able to be used. But again, I think it creates an inherent brittleness inside of an organization that at the end of the day is not going to allow it to be as effective as it could be.
Yeah, his challenge to me is that so many of the management processes that we've inherited from our forefathers have fear as a basic premise for why they were created. And he thought that we were more addicted to it than we thought. Would you disagree with him?
It's interesting. First, I would draw a distinction between management and leadership. I think you manage things and you manage processes and you lead people. And so clearly, if you start to talk about management and you're somehow overlaying that over your responsibilities for inspiring people to a task, I think that's your first problem. You know, it's interesting. You heard him say that's the thing you need to figure out as a leader. When I was a young officer, the very first leadership lesson that really sticks in my mind is we had a battalion commander. That's an individual who leads about 1,000 Marines. And he got the lieutenants in the organization together. Those are all the new guys, about 40 of us. And he said, hey, I'm going to tell you what it takes to be successful inside this organization. And so, as I like to say, we all got on the front of our seats like the oracle at Delphi was about to speak, because we really looked up to this individual, and he was a tremendous leader. And he said, the first thing you need to do as a leader is surround yourself with good people. And then he paused for effect, and he said, well, I forget the other two. And so, you know, again, I think more important than an approach is who are you going to surround yourself with? And if you surround yourself with the right people, well, then positive persuasion works. If you don't surround yourself with the right people, if you don't give clear guidance, if you don't articulate a vision for the organization and give people the wherewithal to actually get that vision accomplished, then perhaps you have to revert back to fear and intimidation, which will only get you so far in my view.
Now, people don't play well scared in any version of life that I know. I think you might agree with that. It's hard. It's hard to be creative. It's hard to learn. It's hard to really fully commit when you're fearful.
Well, Gary, you know, we just talked before we started the call about Clemson and BC football. And so when we talk about fear, just think about a wide receiver. And if the only thought the wide receiver has as he's going down the field is, I hope I don't drop the ball, it's almost sure that he will drop the ball. And if he is visualizing catching the ball and continuing to run once he catches the ball, well, the probability of him being successful has just gone up, you know, geometrically. So, you know, I couldn't agree with you more. If people are afraid to make mistakes, it's very unlikely that they're going to be successful.
Joe, you talked at length in some of your work about the vision creating process that you've used, which is incredibly interesting. You talk about dissent on the front end and having to get people aligned, going in the same direction, which makes perfect sense, right? Leaders go from someplace to someplace better. We better know where we're going. But you talk about a process that you've used to help create that vision.
Yeah, Gary, you know, and I think what I'm going to describe is particularly applicable for kind of a distributed large organization. And so when you have a distributed large organization, obviously the execution on a day-to-day basis is going to be decentralized. People are going to be out there doing what they think is the right thing to do, and you're going to have very little oversight on a daily basis into that. But you want them to be operating within a consistent framework so that the outcome is achieved. The outcome that you've all agreed upon is the right outcome. And so what I've found useful with senior leaders is, you know, very often a process is that a staff or a headquarters will develop a plan and then distribute the plan to subordinate organizations. I actually believe the collective leadership of an organization are responsible for developing a plan in a collaborative way. And there's two reasons for that. One is that I think at the end of the day, they will understand, and understanding is the foundation for implicit communications. And if you're not with somebody on a day-to-day basis and you're trying to conduct distributed operations all over the world, the ability to communicate implicitly can't be overstated. And then, frankly, the plan is going to be better if you tap into the collective leadership of the organization as you craft the plan. And then the other thing that I think all leaders have to think about is succession planning. And you don't ever want the organization to be singularly dependent on a single person to execute. And all the leaders in the organization, particularly those that are the most senior, ought to be able to step up the next day and provide some degree of continuity of operations inside that organization. And so, you know, I think the process of developing a vision for an organization, it's not just, as we used to say, it's not just the plan, it's the planning. And the planning is designed, again, to develop that common understanding of the challenges you're dealing with, a common understanding of the assumptions that are behind the solution you've come up with to deal with those challenges, and then a common understanding of execution. And then what that allows you to do truly is unleash the senior people inside of an organization to go out there and do it. They're all going to be dealing with a different environment, different set of factors, but they're going to come up with a consistent outcome. And we're going to be working towards, again, that common vision.
Right. And you talk about getting the dissent up front, getting the dissent early in the process to make sure we're all on the same wavelength. How did you do that?
And what I used to tell people is, look, prior to the development of the plan, I'm very interested in your views, particularly if you disagree with me. But once we have collectively come together on a vision, what I want you to do is go out and violently execute it like it's your idea. I mean, at that point, it doesn't mean, and by no means am I saying that you don't have a continuous feedback loop and you have a rigid plan that you're not going to change along the way. Why I say that is because I really believe that once a decision is made inside of an organization, that we have now looked at this problem and we've agreed on the solution. Dissent at that point seems to me inappropriate. Again, doesn't mean we don't have a constant feedback loop, but if we bought into the plan, unless you've identified an underlying assumption that no longer obtains, then what we need to be doing is moving along with what we agreed upon was the plan. And I think that an organization can only be successful if everybody has buy-in to the plan.
We can't be marching in the same direction unless we are. Makes perfect sense to me. The practical challenge, interesting for a more senior leader as you were at the end of your career, has to be the idea of speaking up and dissent in general to a general officer, to a superior of some kind. I mean, it takes nerve to go up to the boss and say, I disagree. Once the boss knows where you want to go, that takes some nerve and takes some effort on the senior's part to make that non-threatening, doesn't it?
It does, Gary, but there's two things. One is I really believe that when you think about communications inside of an organization, I used to say that's a higher to lower responsibility. In other words, the senior leader is really responsible for the climate within which communications is taking place inside of an organization. And if you really want to know what's going on in the organization, again, particularly the larger it gets, you're not going to be able to, as I say, see, smell, taste, and touch everything that goes on inside that organization. You have to rely on others to come forward and help you understand what's happening inside that organization. So a lot of people use the words command and control when they think about the U.S. military. And command and control, implies that somebody is in charge and they're controlling what's happening. The expression that I think is more appropriate is command and feedback, where yes, there is somebody in charge and they've provided broad guidance and intent for execution. But the feedback loop is the critical piece where subordinates feel not only empowered, but obligated to tell the boss what's going on, and particularly to tell the boss when he or she have given guidance that is no longer good guidance based on the environment or the conditions that they're dealing with. So that's really what I think is really important. And I do think that command climate is obviously the key to having that kind of feedback loop that's working for you, and that allows an organization to adapt when the conditions change. And that's really critical, because I can't think of any endeavor where the assumptions you made in the planning phase are going to obtain throughout the execution. And so the only way that you can actually be successful is not just react to things when they change, but more importantly, anticipate when things are going to change. And the only way you can anticipate is by having understanding. And the only way that comes is from a constant feedback loop with your subordinates. So if you set the right climate, you'll have the right communications. If you have the right communications, you'll have the inherent flexibility inside your organization to adapt as you execute.
Were there warning signs for you when the climate started to go in the wrong direction? Were there things that you looked at to make sure that the climate was right and you knew you were getting more information?
There are. And I call it's when people start to look at their shoes. When you're in a meeting and you're talking about something and you say, you go visit one of your subordinate organizations and there'll be the senior person sitting there and maybe 5 or 6 other leaders inside that organization. And you say, what do you think? You finished, I've just finished kind of describing what I came here to talk to you about. What do you think? And there's that awkward pause and people start to look down and nobody's responding. And there's 2 things you think about at that point. Number one is maybe the person who's there and in charge doesn't have a climate where his or her subordinates feel like it's okay to speak out now because the boss is there. And then the other thought you have is that maybe I have not conveyed to these folks that I really am serious about getting feedback. Now, I would typically default to the latter as opposed to the former, because I think one of the principles of leadership is that when you first see a problem inside your organization, you should look for the solution in ever increasing concentric circles around your own desk. And then after you've kind of done that self-examination, you can go out and look for other, root causes of the problem that may be inside your organization. But I think if you're out and about with people, you can read the room, so to speak, and you can sense when you haven't quite hit the mark and when maybe you haven't worked hard enough to break down the normal barriers that exist between a senior person and a junior person. No matter what walk of life you're in, everybody wants to make the boss happy, and if in doing that they don't feel like they can ever say something that might be uncomfortable or inconvenient, well, I think you got the wrong command climate.
Yeah, but Max Dupree once said, as the chairman of Herman Miller, he once said that the first responsibility of the leader is to make sure people see reality, and the last is to say thank you. But you said hard work to create the command climate to make sure that you see reality. It is hard work, right? That is, as a job of a leader, that's not easy.
Gary, it's not. In fact, I used to use the Grand Canyon as an analogy. I'd say, look, the natural state of affairs between somebody operating at the most senior levels of the U.S. military and subordinate organizations is the Grand Canyon. Someone has to cross the canyon. And the person that has to cross the canyon is the senior person who needs to reach down inside that organization and break down the barriers that may exist in understanding, in communications, and frankly, in trust, right? That's a word we haven't used yet, but that's a key part of this feedback loop, is that people have to trust you. They have to trust that you're going to take that news, sometimes bad news, you're going to internalize it, and you're going to appreciate the spirit within which that comment was made. You said you wanted feedback, boss. You said you wanted feedback, and as soon as I gave it to you, you exploded. And you said, well, that's a terrible idea. Well, that's a sure way of not getting it ever again, right? And not only does it require hard work, Gary, but it requires discipline as well, because sometimes people are going to say things that might elicit a very strong reaction from you. And it may be an allergic reaction. And you have to kind of, suppress that and make sure that you internalize it and don't lash out at somebody else, because it's for sure that if you do, that's the last time that person is going to offer a view, because the price of doing it and getting it wrong is one they're not willing to pay.
Interesting when you say, I love the analogy of the chasm, of the Grand Canyon, and that it's the leader's responsibility to cross it first. It kind of goes with the idea is trust, to use that word, given or earned. In some ways, then, to cross the canyon, you have to give trust before you could expect to get trust, in that analogy. Would that be true?
I think there's no doubt. I mean, clearly it has to go both ways, but I do think, again, the responsibility for a leader is to set that environment of trust. People have to see in your day-to-day, and by the way, that's not one thing you can do, right? You can't go into an organization and say, trust me. It's their observations of how you do business every day. Are you a person of integrity? Do you hold people accountable? Do you actually practice what you preach? When you say that you're going to do some things, do you actually do them? And so over time, and that's really I would argue is a factor in all this. Over time, you will develop trust because there is consistency between your words and your actions, and that to me is the formula. And then once that happens, and you're a leader, you have to be a good judge of character. Inherently after working with people, whether these are individuals who can trust you, because you're watching them just like they're watching you. It's a process of coming together, building a team, and then developing that common bond of trust where you can both go off in your own direction, do your own jobs, and know that the person that's over there that you can't see is doing exactly what you all agreed upon that they would do.
change gears just a little bit and use that trust, because it reminds me that in about 2016, they changed at least some of the nature of the job of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs when they made you you call it a global integrator, in terms of global force integrator, maybe in terms of being the adjudicator of military options around the world without real chain of command authority, but you have to influence people through the power of your vision and the trust and the things you've been talking about with no line authority. There's a lot been written recently about how we need to do that more in general as leaders. That must have you must have some lessons from that you learned along the way about how to influence in those kind of relationships.
No, Gary, I do. And I think it's important in this one. This may take a few minutes because you have to go back and say, why did we establish that global integrator? And in short, we established the global integrator because we recognized that almost all of the problems we were dealing with in the U.S. military were trans-regional problems. So they cut across multiple geographic areas. So no single commander, and we're organized in a geographic construct, no single commander could deal with problems like Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, violent extremism. By definition, it required integration. Secondly, we're no longer conducting operations confined to sea, air, and land. We now have space and cyberspace. And so not all of the forces in the U.S. military belong to an individual commander. Some of the forces actually support multiple commanders. So with that as background, we recognize that our planning process needed to change. The way the Secretary of Defense made decisions, and more importantly, the way we supported the Secretary of Defense in making decisions needed to change. And the way we prioritized and allocated the resources globally needed to change so that we could manage risk at the Secretary of Defense's level properly. That's the important thing, is we could manage risk globally by having somebody that could pull together an integrated picture for the Secretary of Defense. Because what didn't change, Gary, is the level at which decisions were made. The Secretary of Defense was still, as appropriate, the decider inside the Pentagon for these big decisions. My job, as a result of that legislation, which we initiated and worked very closely with Senator McCain and others at the time to implement this legislation. In my view, my job was to work with the other senior military leaders, one, to develop plans that were suitable for a global problem. Number two, develop the right framework within which we could support, again, the Secretary's decision-making, and then bring to the Secretary, in a timely manner, the right decisions framed properly for execution. And so I honestly, the key piece, it goes back to how do you lay out a vision? We brought people in quarterly to look at the problem sets we were dealing with, to make sure that we all understood the problem we were trying to solve, the framework within which we were going to try to solve that problem, and what level of decisions needed to be made, or what decisions need to be made and at what level. And I think the key piece is, it's a simple one, Gary, but it comes down to communicating. It comes, Jack Welch, I read something that he wrote once, and it stuck with me, and I probably read it 25 years ago. Jack Welch, when he was at GE, said, if you think you're communicating well enough inside your organization, it would be time to double it. And so I think, I really think that was the key enabler for global integration, was communicating with the subordinate commanders, bringing them in, and going through a process that would highlight the issues at the level of depth necessary for us to be able to tackle them.
So again, it came back with this disparate group of people that you're coordinating. The first step, again, is, it's that V word, that vision word, that where are we going? I mean, it seems appropriate in that when you say, follow me, every leader gets asked the same two questions. Where are we going and why is it important? And you spend a lot of time trying to coordinate a shared sense of a shared outcome.
Well, Gary, if you took any specific security problem we were dealing with, let's take the Russia problem set. Let me describe the process, because I think it'll put a finer point on this vision. We would have a series of meetings, and we did have a series of meetings about Russia over the course of the year. to develop the new plan in the context of this global integration. The first meeting would be, what problem are we trying to solve? What are the assumptions that we all make? And what is the environment within which we're actually trying to accomplish these tasks? And what's really, in my view, what's really important is, I used to call it getting people in a funnel. Do you buy these assumptions? Yes or no? Do we agree that this is what we're trying to do? Yes or no? Are these the conditions under which we are trying to do it? Yes or no? Well, but pretty soon you're pretty far down into the funnel and everybody's moving in the same direction because you've kind of built the framework together for how you're going to solve that particular problem. And that was really important for us because dealing with Russia was not a European problem. It was a European command problem. It was a Middle Eastern Central Command problem. It was a Indo-Pacific command problem. And so it was a cyber command problem. It was a space command problem. So by building understanding in that very deliberate way, and there is a framework, and it was a very consistent framework we applied to all of these problem sets. And again, it started with, what problem are we trying to solve? What assumptions do we make as we move out as a team? What are the conditions under which we're trying to solve it? Okay, now we can start to talk about how. We spent a lot of time on the what. We spent a lot of time on the environment within which we would be trying to accomplish the what. And then you can decentralize the execution of the how individuals would solve the problem at their particular level. And I just found that deliberate framework and the consistency and application of that framework gave us the best opportunity to achieve the results we wanted.
It's sort of a resist the natural inclination to jump from a quick what to how, right? So here's problem, here's solution. There's much more on the what, much more granularity to the process of making sure we're all on the same page.
Right, Gary, because when somebody says to me, back to that issue of dissent, I don't like what we're doing, my typical response would be, okay, here were the 6 assumptions that we made when we started this. Or is there one of these 6 assumptions you don't like anymore, or you don't agree has obtained? Okay, no, I agree with all those. Okay, fine. All right, here's what we said were the operating environment and the conditions under which we would be trying to accomplish this mission. Is there anything in the operating environment that's changed? Any of the facts changed? Because that's important. No. I don't think that's the case. Okay, we talked about priorities, in this case, global priorities, and we agreed that these were the priorities. Have these priorities changed? No, they haven't changed. Okay, so what is it that you don't like about that? Well, never mind. In other words, it's what's important. So I'm not crushing dissent, but there's got to be an intellectual rigor about providing that input. I mean, you have to have a foundation upon that input. And my line used to be, Gary, all the time was, look, I understand what you're against. I got it. And I understand that. What are you for? Tell me if this is not how to solve the problem, please help me. And if you have a better idea than mine, I got it and I'm on it. And we'll use your idea and we'll move out. So that's why I think going through that process has, at least for me personally, has been so helpful. And I think not only personally, but really across the joint force, as we were dealing with very complex problems, the more you focus on unpacking those problems and truly delving into what I call knowledge and understanding, the better chance you have of coming up with solutions that by definition, if these problems are in your inbox, they're not easy problems to solve, right? And there is no single way of solving them. And in many cases, there's no good way of addressing them. There's only better ways. And I think you have a much better chance of getting to the best way if you spend time. I used to quote Einstein all the time because, and whether he said this or not, he should have, and I think I read it somewhere, but he said, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 59 minutes, my words, framing a problem, and 1 minute actually solving it. And I really do believe in that broad philosophy that's in that quick anecdote.
And yet, I think that it shows the power of that, because I think my experience has been so many times with groups, we spend little time defining the problem, and we spend a lot of time arguing about the hows.
Right. And at the strategic level, if you begin to act without thinking, the consequences are profound. At the tactical level, in a production management in a business sense or something, if you move out, you make a mistake, there's probably the time and the space, so to speak, to fix the mistake and move on. At the strategic level, if you haven't really thought through deliberately what it is you're trying to do inside the organization, it's really hard to put it back in the box.
It must be the same skills that you're bringing to Lockheed Martin. The board of directors has the same issues, right?
No, absolutely. I mean, look, what's consistent is I think every leader, no matter what endeavor you're in, you really have to think in two ways. You got to solve the problems that the organization is dealing with today, and you got to think about how you posture the organization to be successful tomorrow. So that was and if someone asked me, what was your most difficult challenge as the chairman, I suspect the last 5 chairmen, the last 5 secretaries of defense would have said, balancing that risk between today and tomorrow, getting that right, because the operational challenges you're dealing with today could totally consume the organization and could consume all the resources available to you. And yet you have to balance assuming some risk today to make the right investments to posture the organization be successful tomorrow. And certainly now in my limited time in the private sector, in a number of endeavors, it's very similar. I mean, I've watched now a new CEO take over from Lockheed Martin, and that leader right away and intuitively, a very successful individual, been a CEO before. First thing Jim Takelet is grappling with is, okay, we got to satisfy the needs of the customer today. And we've got to anticipate what is the customer going to need tomorrow, even before the customer has asked us, where is our research and development priority? Where are we going to look at science and technology? What investments are we going to make based on what we believe the customer is going to ask us for, as opposed to tagged against a specific requirement? That requires, again, a very similar, I'm very comfortable with the conversations we have in the board at Lockheed Martin, because the basic framework of how to think through strategic problems, in my own view now, again, limited experience, but it's a complete carryover in terms of strategic problem solving. Framing a problem, identifying the assumptions, and then clearly articulating what it is we have to do now and in the future.
It leads me to an interesting question about those kinds of framings. It's been often said in the literature over the years that seeing reality is difficult and hard work, but imagining something different is even harder for most people. Do you believe that's true? It's that we get so used to executing and getting it done and being efficient and being productive that imagining something very different from what exists today is difficult for a lot of leaders.
It is, Gary. And, I think I appreciated that even as I assumed responsibility in my last job. And one of the first things that I did was I asked a good friend of mine I'd known a long time, who is not a person who served in the U.S. military, but a PhD and a very thoughtful person, was my political advisor in Afghanistan for a couple of years. And I asked him to be a part of my staff. And he had 2 responsibilities. One is to just offer a different viewpoint. And the other is I asked him to assume responsibility for my own continuing education in the job by reaching out to people in various sectors that we didn't come in contact with every day. And so we would go up to MIT and talk to the Chinese experts or talk about artificial intelligence or machine learning with people who were dealing with it. We would talk to, before I'd go on a trip to India, we'd bring in some of the notable academics and practical practitioners and people from industry who had dealt with India, so I could understand that. And I think that the only way that you can, and I think you bring up a great point, Gary, a leader does have a responsibility to imagine the future, make some assumptions about the future, and then make some decisions informed by those assumptions. And I think that whenever you become comfortable that you've finished your path of education, that's the beginning of the end, I think, as for relevance as a leader. And the only way you can imagine the future is by continuing to read, to continue to stay engaged, and continue to listen to people who have a different experience than your own. And if that's not in a disciplined way injected into your entire organization, over time, the organization will become stagnant.
You know, I heard this really interesting thing. Walter Isaacson told me not that long ago. He told me that if you're going to innovate for the outside the box, he says, if you want to think outside the box, you better spend a lot of time understanding what's in the box before you try to get outside the box. Sort of the same thing as you better be really educated about where you are and what might be before you try to guess about the future.
Gary, absolutely. In fact, I've used that expression, and I couldn't agree more that even with subordinates that say, well, I think we need some out-of-the-box thinking. Okay, but let's make sure we know what's in the box. Why are we not going to do what's in the box? And now we'll start talking about what's outside of the box. The other thing I used to say is, look, I would just ask you to please give me input based on 51% analysis before you apply your 49% art and intuition. I mean, I'm interested in that, but I would like to be founded on the facts first, and if we can get to 51% analysis and then 49% art and intuition, and I obviously use it as a figure of speech, I'll be comfortable because we'll have some data that's driving our decision making, and then we'll apply our experience and our vision on top of that data. But we can't use intuition to understand the current environment. There are some, kind of inconvenience sometimes, but there are some facts we have to deal with, and we need to expose those facts that exist so that our assumptions are founded on reality. And I think I couldn't agree more with the point you made.
So here's the tough question. We spend in the United States, we spend between 14 and $19 billion a year in leadership development, trying to develop better leaders. Only about a third of the people in our country are highly engaged in their work, and most don't trust their leaders, if you believe the surveys these days. And we spend all this money trying to develop better leaders, and we've been doing it for a couple decades without much success. We can't seem to move the needle. The responsibility of a leader to create other leaders, I know you've been thinking about mentorship, and it's a serious work for most great leaders like that. What advice would you give leaders and companies trying to develop new leaders? We have to find a better way to do it.
Yeah, Gary, look, I think there's two pieces to the problem, right? There's the leadership selection piece, and then there's the leadership development piece. And I do think that there are certain qualities and characteristics, depending on what endeavor you're involved in, there's certain qualities and characteristics that can allow somebody to be a good leader in that context. And while there are some leadership qualities that cut across, there's obviously some unique requirements for leaders in certain industries, certain endeavors. And I think that perhaps they should spend more time on leadership selection and clearly identifying the qualities and characteristics that they are looking for inside of leaders in the organization. Because something I'll say that some people may not agree with is, if you don't have the right product going into this $14 to $19 billion enterprise, if you don't have the right product going in, I can guarantee you won't have the right product coming out. And so, it's interesting. I did spend a lot of time, because succession planning is one of the more important responsibilities I had in my last assignment, making recommendations to the Secretary of Defense and the President as to who the future leaders would be. And I spent 2 years, I had a couple of folks over at National Defense University study the top, we picked 40 leaders, and we looked at their career patterns, we looked at their education, we looked at, as many things as we could to identify what were the commonalities in the good ones. Because even at the 4-star level, some 4 stars that we selected were immediately capable of performing their duties at a high level. And others took some time to grow into that. And what I was trying to do was identify were there any specific things in leadership development that we can look at. Interesting, most of what we could observe, in other words, the empirical evidence, was almost exactly the same in all those 40 individuals. what we found were there were kind of qualities inside of certain individuals that would allow them to operate at the next level. And we should be clear about this, I think, when we're developing leaders, there are unique skill sets. Because somebody is a good production manager doesn't mean they're going to be a good COO. And we need to be clear about the differences that we have in leadership at various levels. And one of the things that I used to use in leadership development, I borrowed the 10,000 hour expression, and I'd say, look, first we pick the right people, and then we have to identify the 10,000 hours that we need to give them to be what we want them to be. And I would break that 10,000 hours down into three components. One was experience, and one was education, and one was training. So the experience, you can't short circuit that. There's certain career path you have to have. Education is that how to think at that next level. And then the training is how to do at that next level. And I think that I'm not sure if all of these training programs have had a deliberate process of accepting people into these programs, identifying the experience, which has to be, again, an input, and then balancing the education and the training piece, where you actually are probably spending 80% of your time on how to solve problems at this level, and 20% of your time on the technical aspects and the training piece of that. That should come from the experience piece. You shouldn't be identified as somebody ready to go to the next level if you don't have the technical competence. But there are, in my view, different skill sets associated with problem solving at a different level. And that's where these programs ought to focus on is how do you deal with these things, similar to what we've been talking about. How do you frame problems at the next level, and how do you come up with comprehensive solutions that have a high probability of being successful?
And one more thing about it, I think might be really interesting to just chat about for a second. A mentor of mine, a guy died in the last couple of years named Warren Bennis, used to say all the time that the one truism for him in building a great team was you had to have a leader, much as the inputs, as you say, who believes that ordinary people are capable of doing extraordinary things. There has to be an innate belief in the ability of people to be extraordinary. I think you would agree with that.
Gary, those are exactly the words that I use. And if you think about, in my case, in the U.S. military, by and large, the people that we're bringing in, I'm very proud of them, very good people, but these are ordinary men and women from all over the country and, various diverse backgrounds and so forth. And you can put them together and they do accomplish extraordinary things. And they accomplish extraordinary things under the most difficult of conditions. And they do that, in my view, because of there's intangibles that a leader injects inside the organization. We call it esprit de corps in the Marine Corps, but it's kind of a sense of responsibility to the organization and to each other. That has to be injected. Trust, we already spoke about it. I'll give you an example of this extraordinary people or ordinary people doing extraordinary things. One of the books that had a huge impact on me as a young lieutenant was a book called With the Old Breed. And it was written by a private first class who fought on Tarawa. And I highlighted in the book a section where he said, the one thing I learned about Tarawa is you can come through anything if you trust your leadership, if you trust the person on your left and right, and you trust your training. That's the formula. And so there's truly ordinary people at a place like Tarawa dealing with absolutely the worst of human conditions, and yet they were successful, and you'd have to argue that's extraordinary. They did something that was extraordinary. And there's, in the words of a private first class, 19 years old, when he wrote those words, there's the magic formula, and it's not so magic.
Couple quick questions, Joe. 2 leaders, living or dead, who most influenced your thinking or you most admire?
Yeah, I'm very fortunate because the first answer I always give to that was my dad. I didn't have to, when I was growing up, I didn't have to look very far for a role model. I didn't have to look very far for somebody who you could trust. I didn't have to look very far for someone who had character and did the right thing. In his case, as a husband, as a father, in his job, and so I was very fortunate in that regard. And in terms of self-improvement, he got his college degree the year after I did, and he had a better GPA. And he did that because, with all those sons, he said, and when I even wavered a bit on going to college, he said, hey, look, that's not an option. You're the oldest, and you're going to set the example for all the rest of them. And he actually, when you think about it, he practiced what he preached. He was working full-time, going to night school, and therefore none of us could say education wasn't important. He as I used to say, a leader shows what's important by his or her physical presence. He showed education was important by doing it himself at a fairly late age. Gary, this would be one I'm very lucky. I could probably give you 20 names. The second one that always comes to mind immediately is I went to work, and this was for me a very formative experience. I went to work for the Commandant of the Marine Corps in 1992. I was a major, about to be a lieutenant colonel, and the individual's name was Carl Mundy. And I was a speechwriter for a year, and then spent 2 years as a senior aide. And probably, certainly during those 3 years, spent far more time with him than I did with my family, traveling all over the world and doing things. And I watched him deal with a couple of very, very significant issues, one of which at the time, there was at least rumors that he was going to be fired because of it. And I watched how he dealt with adversity. And I learned a lot about watching him. And I learned a lot about values. I learned a lot about character. In this whole idea of communicating, I learned a lot about communicating by watching him as well. And so I could add 10 names to those two, but those would be the first two.
What are you reading, Joe? What are you reading?
You know what? So I just finished, and it's interesting. I just finished rereading The Best and the Brightest, which I read it years ago, and when you read it, I'm reading it now, as you do with every book. You read it through the lens of your experience and what you're dealing with now. And I thought, and I think it'd be a good book for a lot of Americans to read, just as we think about moving forward and trying to address the challenges we're dealing with, and what might be some things we ought to think about before we move forward. And then because I've been working on China just in the last probably 6 weeks or so, I reread The 100-Year Marathon, which is Pillsbury's book on China, which is excellent, and it's had a big impact, I think, on the consensus view of China in Washington, D.C. And then I also read Graham Allison's book. The title of it is Destined for War, and it really talks about the Thucydides trap. So it talks about historically the challenge of a rising power and a status quo power, and can you avoid war? And he breaks it down into 16 different cases to highlight what are the prospects for going to war for China, and I think highlights also what might we do to avoid war and come up with a solution to competition.
Last question for me. I'm a young officer, I'm a young leader, and I come up to you, Joe, and I say, one piece of advice, or just one piece of advice you could give me that would shorten my trails as a leader, what would you tell them?
Yeah, I'd probably emphasize listen to people. And Gary, I'd give him this example. You gave me one word, I'm going to take a little bit more. And I'd say, when I was you as a second lieutenant, my level of confidence that I had all the answers was way up here. And my level of experience was way down here. And I now have 42 years of active duty behind me. And my level of confidence that I have all the answers is way down here. And my level of experience is arguably up here. Because I have learned that there are no simple answers to really complex problems. And a degree of humility as a young leader, listening to people, learning. No one expects you to know everything. No one expects you to be all-knowing and all-seeing as a young leader. In fact, they will respect you more if they see that you're eager to learn, you're willing to listen, and you're willing to grow. And if you do that, people are going to get behind you and they're actually going to make you succeed. It's not about you. It's not about you. It's about the team, and you're going to actually get them to be moving in the right direction and enabling success of the organization because they want you to be successful. They want the organization to be successful. So that'd be at least the beginning of what would, I hope, be a longer dialogue if I was talking to a new lieutenant, because what I'd like to do is shed some of these sea bag of lessons learned. Many of them learned the hard way.
Well, Joe, I can't thank you enough for spending time with us this morning. I think the lessons you've given us this morning are at least part of that sea bag that I've learned a lot from this morning. So thank you for your wisdom. Again, thank you for your service and your willingness to share those experiences with us today. And I'd also like to thank the Washington Speakers Bureau for helping us make this dialogue possible, and their commitment to helping to create dialogues that further our leadership thinking so that we can create more cultures that are not only more effective, but help people reach their potential. Thanks, Joe. I hope I see you again soon.
Thanks, Gary. It was great spending time with you. Take care.